Welcome to the Business of Family, the podcast where we explore the stories, challenges, and opportunities of family businesses. I'm your host, Tammy Buss, and I'm a family business survivor, and I'm also a family business advisor. In this show, we'll be talking with family business leaders and experts to bring you insights and inspiration so you too can survive your family business journey. Whether you're a founder, a successor, a professional, or just curious about family business, this podcast is for you. So today, our guest is Wendy MacIntyre. She's back again. We had her back a little
Hi.
while ago. She is the senior consultant and founder of Resolve HR. And we had this great conversation, but I really wanted to have Wendy back to talk about policies and procedures, because I think that's one of the issues that is lacking when you are a first to second generation family business. So if you want the whole story, go back. I think it's the beginning of April was Wendy's first podcast release with us. So anyway, we're going to get right into it. Welcome, Wendy.
Thank you. Great to see you. Great to hear you.
Yes. So listen, I want to jump right in and talk about,
Sure.
the really why you need sort of formal policies and procedures, in particular with family businesses, and why there's a little bit of difference between a family business and a non-family business. I know that's a lot. That's probably 25 minutes right there.
It could be. It could be. A couple of the passions, right? For me, HR and family business and business in general. So quite often businesses realize that they need different people to help them out with their business. So you need an accountant, you need a lawyer, you get registered, you've got different pieces, but the HR component can be a little bit more intangible, I guess. And when we're in a family, we think that we have all of our relationships figured out because we've been practicing it for a long, long time. However, when we are building a business, when we don't know, when we're not doing it with our family, we know that scaling can be very challenging, and you don't have that trust built up like you do with a family. So you need to figure out the norms and you need to figure out what's acceptable, what's not. And that's hard as it is. But when you start in with a family, you think that you know all these things already. You think everybody's on the same path.
Hmm.
And something that I came across one time in some reading I was doing, it said, you think everybody has the same goal, but we have different maps. So
Yes,
how we
yes,
get there, and that's where your policies and
absolutely.
procedures are so
Hmm. Hmm.
useful because it can mitigate risk from the get-go. Usually we build those policies and procedures as we realize, oh, not everybody had the same map on that one.
I know it's after a problem, but you find that
It's
when
always,
something
yes.
happens, and then you realize that you actually need a policy and procedure for sure.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens. And I've gone to different clients. I was with one the other day and going through their employee policies and procedures, and I thought, what the heck? They've got 3 pages on fraud, and then they might have a paragraph on confidentiality. And I
Mm.
think, oh, something happened there
Yeah.
because they've got all this, and then they don't have anything on some other policies that I think, oh, you really need to look at that.
Hmm.
So it tends to be as things happen, we react, and that's when we put in a policy. But it would be so much more helpful if we did that in advance, especially with our family. Like my husband joined my business a year ago, and we joke and we say he's been in training for 28 years. Uh, but there's some things that we have to actually say out loud because we think, oh, I thought you knew that. You didn't know that?
Hmm.
Oh,
Hmm.
okay.
Well, we're
How do we
so
do
close.
this?
We're so close to them, right? We think that they know everything, and if everybody was aligned and knew what other people were thinking, I'd be out of a job. So I'm kind of,
You
and
and me
probably you would
both.
be too. Yeah. So would you consider policies and procedures to be sort of an enhanced handbook?
Yes, yes. And I often call them an employee handbook, but employee handbook, employee manual, employee policies. And I kind of differentiate between policies and procedures
Hmm.
because procedures gets into a lot of explanation about things that you don't need to have write in your policies. And that's something that when I work with clients, I help tease those apart.
Yeah, I was going to say it's very important, right? You have a policy, sort of a policy manual and a procedures manual, and the policy would be more
Yeah,
for the employees, and the procedure would that
exactly.
be more for the roles?
Could be. It could be. I've seen them where they have a lot about health and safety. So they have a health and safety program, depending on the type of business, if that's something that's
Mhm,
front and center for them. I've had seen them where they're more for administrators. So your procurement policy or things to do with financials or that not all of your employees need to know. And usually
mhm,
they're more of a step by step and also show your parameters and limitations. Whereas an employee handbook, an employee manual, employee policies, they can be very short, like a paragraph for each item, or it could be a page or two for each item. It depends on your culture in your
mhm.
workplace as well. I find that shorter is better because nobody wants to read a long one.
No, no.
So if nobody's going to read it or go to it, then it's not useful.
So, what are some of the key policies or procedures that family businesses should consider sort of documenting, and maybe they haven't done anything in the past? Because again, when you're small and starting out, you as you bring on help, um, it becomes more complicated. But we tend to not go back because we're so busy in the business that we don't tend to go back and actually write this stuff down until a problem happens. But what would be some of the key ones that you would have people start with if they don't have anything written down in place now?
Some of the very main ones that people should have are policies on vacation, holidays, sick leave, or wellness leave. You might also want to have something about EDI or DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, to talk about your hiring practices and what's needed there. Employment of relatives. I
Hmm.
mean,
Hmm.
in some ways it's obvious, yes, we're going to employ our relatives, but how does that work? And what about reporting lines? And how do other employees that aren't related, how do they fit into that? There's been some other things of late, especially coming up about AI in the workplace and
Hmm.
how do you accommodate that? One that we've been starting to put in just recently is recordings in the workplace. So one thing about Canada is as a single party, I'm going to go down the rabbit hole for a
Okay, that's fine. That's
minute.
fine.
One in Canada, we're a single party consent country, where in the States, anybody who's being recorded has to be aware of it and be okay with it. Where in Canada, I could be recording a meeting I'm in with a dozen people, and I may be the only one to know about that. I don't have to tell anybody else. And that
Mm-hmm.
is legal. However, you need to have a policy on that because just because something is legal doesn't mean that you're going to allow it in your workplace.
Right. Right.
And it really erodes trust when people find out that it's been recorded. And when it's family, it can be used in different ways that, it might be more not laid back, but more less formal and kind of get into different places where it can be really harmful for trust with your family
Hmm.
and for working together. So you want to be, that's one policy that we're starting to get more and more into. Um, and it would depend on the country, the jurisdiction, but that's the difference between the States and Canada.
Hmm. That's interesting. Because we watch a lot of American television, so it's always about,
Yeah.
everybody has to know what's happening unless it's a, undercover wire from a from
Right.
a from
Yeah,
a cop show or something, right?
exactly.
So I want to
Exactly.
just go back to the employment for family members, and that's one of the things that I talk about with my families is about what is the policy around that for themselves because it's easy when you're first generation and you've got two kids, everybody's allowed to be to join the company if they want or whatever the oh no you can't join, you got to
Mhm.
go do something else first, and every family's different, right, about how they allow other family members to enter. But as you go deeper and you're now into, say, Gen 2's working and you have Gen 3 in the wings and you've got three kids, they could each have three kids. And now you've got, nine people or nine relatives. How does that work? So I talk about that a lot to say you got to develop this system before, or this policy before it becomes a problem? Or how do you become manager, or what is the procedure? Is it the same as a employee, or is it different because you're a family member? So how do you deal with that when you're talking to your clients?
And I love what you're saying, map that out in advance about who's
Mm-hmm.
doing what and who's allowed in and having, I love the idea of having to work somewhere else and coming back to give some different sense of it. And it also helps with respect of one another when you've probably got people coming in from the outside and then seeing they've never worked anywhere else. How do they know
Yeah.
anything? Um,
I always say that about people who worked in head offices who weren't out actually in the
yes.
field, right? Down at
The
ground
ivory,
level.
yeah, the ivory tower folks,
Yes,
right?
yes. They have
Yeah.
no idea what's happening down here.
No, that's it. That's it. So some of the things when it comes to looking at family employees is you want to look at what your reporting relationship is. What does reporting look like? Do you allow a child or a spouse or a sibling to report directly to another family member, or do you say we have to have somebody else, a dotted line to somebody else for reporting, or maybe it is you have to report to your family member, but this is how it's going to look. And this is how we do performance management and to set up really clear expectations and measurements for how to do that performance management. And every now and then, something that I encourage people to do is a 360-degree feedback assessment where you get information from everybody around you, not just your manager. And that can help with performance management. So to put some of those pieces into place, um, and and one thing too that when you have a mix of family members and non-family members is the idea of transparency that we always talk about.
Mm.
And do people know how everyone's evaluated? Do people know what's happening and how much do they need to know
Yeah.
and how much not to let them know?
Yeah, that's true. And so when you're talking about those family dynamics, you're talking about just an employee who's not a family member. Do you actually have like different manuals, or is it just something that's documented for the family, and then the other team members have their own documents? I mean, how do you actually put that into practice?
Right, that's a good question. And I would say it's the same employee policies for everybody. Where you can have differences is in the employment agreement between individuals. So if there's different pieces, then you can say in your employment agreement to say, okay, these you follow the employee policies. Here are some differences, and what's in this agreement will supersede what's in the policies. So maybe they get more vacation time, or
Hmm.
maybe they have something that's different, or maybe they have, part of their pay is through shares or dividends or bonuses. So you don't have to let everybody know that,
Hmm.
but have those documented somewhere. And we often think, we'll just, it's just what we do. It's just what we do. But if there's any change in a family member, that history, you want to have it documented.
Right,
Um,
right.
and
You
again,
know,
it's no, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, when you have the family members and that you have their own sort of documents, and you're recommending that, how many of your clients actually have employment agreements with their family members?
Not very many, not very many. And it's something that we work on when we have clients and we bring them in. We ask, what do you have for documentation? It sounds like a boring thing to have, and it
Hmm.
feels, and a lot of families, they feel like that's insulting to give to a family member, but it's for everybody's safety and it's to manage risk for everybody. Um, but not too many do have them. Not too many have policies either when you're working with a family business until, as we said, when something comes up, then we
Hmm.
deal with it. But people are getting better and better at having those pieces in place because we hear about what's happening out there and what happens to other people. And we're, oh, I don't want that to happen here, so let's put something in place.
And the other thing, when you talk about policies and procedures, in particular when you're a smaller company, you don't have these, right? Once you're a larger company and you've got,
Yeah.
a lot of employees, you have no choice, but you have to put these in place because something's happened along the way.
Right.
But in the beginning, one of the issues that come up a lot is pay equity. And, you know, there's nothing really documented to say this is the scale you're at. Because I've got clients who say, like, this person's been with me so long, they're like way out of their pay scale. Like they're making more than the key people in my firm that should be, making
Yeah.
this kind of money. They're making more than they are. So how do you even talk about that? Because I think that's a big issue, particularly for long-term employees who just keep getting raises and raises and raises, and then, they're making 80,000 when it's a, 35 or $40,000 job. That becomes a problem. So do you talk about that at all?
Yeah, yeah. We do some compensation studies and looking at classification for different things. And like you said, as it gets bigger, then you need to look at those things. There's other ways to do compensation. There's other ways, like you can do bonuses or you can do here's something so that you're not guaranteeing it on a go forward basis. And if somebody were to look at how much people are being paid, it doesn't show up and it isn't so in your face. However, if somebody's just been with you a long time and maybe their job is only worth, say, 50,000 and they're being paid 80, that that discrepancy, when people find out, there's so much, it feels bad. It
Mm-hmm.
feels
Mm-hmm.
bad. I had an employee I had for a while who was ending up making more than I was because I was getting them set up for
Yeah.
success, but at my own detriment. And I resented it so much.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so how do you deal with it when it's already the case is to say, we need to red circle this because I've done some research looking at what else is out there for pay. So red circling is when you say, this is what you're making now. We're not giving you any more raises. But maybe we'll give you time off. Maybe we'll give you a passion project that you can work on work time. Maybe we can give you a bonus. Maybe we can do something else.
Mm.
And, they might also say, yeah, I understand.
Yeah,
I
I
can't be
probably
paid
not because
anymore.
they've been there for a while, and there's a bit of an entitlement, right? So, and I'm not saying that in all cases, but some would actually get it. But I think that's, really important because I've seen that happen more times than I care to talk about, where you've had, a first generation business, and you've had somebody with you for a long time, and they just took on more responsibilities, and you just gave them more money, and then they basically price themselves out of the market, but they've been with you for so long. So I think that's why it's really important to think about that at the beginning.
Mm,
Um,
yeah,
but as when you're starting out a business, there's so many things to think about, and the costs are so high that you spend more of your time sort of organizing and planning than you actually do working, to
yeah,
bring in income. But I do
yeah.
think it's important, and I wanted to just talk about that a little bit, about some of the important things to do, talk about and document when you're starting
Mm,
out, to avoid some of those issues later on,
yeah,
because it happens all the time, and you know
yeah.
it's unfortunate that that happens. But so again, you're going to run into some conflicts when you're talking about family businesses. What are some of the conflict resolutions that you use, or what are some of the tools that you use with the clients when they do have an issue when they're trying to write these policies and procedures?
When it comes to some different ways that I've done put policies in place for employers is sometimes I will go through pretty much line by line. I say, here's what you need. What are you doing now? Let's get this so we make sure that everything's included in it. And then we might go through it line by line, or I might say, here's what you should have. What do you think? Um, so there's a couple of different approaches, but then when it comes to there's a conflict in the workplace, it's one of my favorite areas, conflict, bullying, and harassment. Um, and it happens with families. And sometimes
Mhm.
too, a family might be, that's just the way they argue. Um, but your employees around them that aren't family don't know that, it can be terrifying.
Hmm. Hmm.
They might think, oh my gosh, mom and dad are going to break up, and what am I going to do? I won't have a job. Um, or
Or the
they're actually,
employees are all running for the hills.
right? Exactly. So when it comes to looking at conflict, there's a few different approaches, and there can be interest-based negotiations or interest-based conflict resolution where you don't look at what people's positions are. So I might say, well, I want Tammy fired and I'll stay here. But instead you look at, well, what's happening underneath that? Why are you thinking Tammy needs to be fired? What else could we come to terms with that's a base value that we can work on? Right now, I'm actually doing training on insights-based mediation, and it's a newer version of conflict resolution. And it's actually being used in collaborative practice with lawyers for family law. And it is so effective. And what it does is it doesn't look at what are your positions, what's been happening in the past, but what do you want going forward? And how do you hear one another? And are you sure that that's what is that what you intended? Is that what they're hearing? And it just opens up so many conversations that maybe we thought, well, everybody knows that.
Yeah.
They know what I'm thinking. They know what to do. Well, maybe they don't. Maybe you've made your
It's not a maybe
assumptions.
they don't. It's probably they don't. And it's interesting because when you said about family law, I always said that's the probably the worst discipline in law is family law. And here I am dealing with family businesses all the time. It's exactly what I do. And I'm like, how did that happen? But it's
Yes.
true. So one of the things that we do is we try to use a couple of assessment tools so that we can understand who they are and they can understand who they are and each other, which again opens up that line of communication to you're never going to eliminate conflict, but what you're going to understand is they don't do it intentionally, right? That's who they are. And to look to forget the past, like you say, you have to look at what you want moving forward. And again, when you work together, it comes home, right? So it's not just about what happens at work. And I think it's really important, not only for your regular employees, but in particular the family members, to have the policies and procedures so that there's no jealousy, there is no entitlement. So, well, they get this many, how come they're always off and I'm working hard? Or, they make the same amount as me as I'm always working. So I think that's really important that we forget about until a problem happens. You're like, with my kids, I'm going to treat them all equally. But there's fair versus equal, and that comes across in the
That's right.
business, right?
Yeah, fair, equal, equitable.
Hmm.
They're very different things. And yeah, any sibling rivalry from the past would definitely be coming into the workplace
Oh,
as
absolutely.
well.
Because they
Yeah.
think of their sibling as, the 6-year-old that was, playing with their toys or pulling their hair or whatever it happened to be. And
Right.
and the parents think about that too, right? So that's a lot of what I do as family business advising is to try to align the family so they all agree. I said it's kind of like a prenup in that when everybody's
That's
happy,
perfect.
you can set all the parameters and say this is fair. Yeah, that makes sense. So that when there is an issue and a conflict, and there is going to be conflict, that you can refer back to the documents and
Yeah.
say this is how we're going to resolve these issues.
Oh, I
And
love
so I
that.
love your name of your company, Resolve HR. It's perfect because that's what you're trying to do is resolve some of these issues.
Yeah.
So
I was something that's been coming up in my age group is looking at parents that are aging
mm,
and how that can look. And I think your idea of a prenup and figuring out how things will work. Well, when your parents are aging, what's what changes? What about the caretaking of your
mhm,
parents
mhm.
and the business? Like it's all very tangly. Um,
Absolutely. It's
and
a tangle of a mess. And I would say, when you have a family and you have a business, they have their own issues, but when you put them together, it's just,
oh,
it
exponential
yes,
can be.
yes.
Yeah, it's beautiful
And
and challenging.
absolutely. There are so many benefits to being a family business. They far outweigh the negatives, but we tend to focus a lot on the negatives. When one thing goes bad, one thing goes sideways, one comment, you know, the gloves are off and they're duking it out in the boardroom. I mean, it's
Yeah,
pretty
and
funny,
memories
but
like elephants.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So
Yes.
I want, as you know, I like to end with three tips. So if we're going to talk about policies and procedures, what are the three tips that you would give families in business?
Find out what's working in your sector and in your type of business for other businesses. Learn from others. I think having your network, having a consultant like you who's familiar with other businesses, what's coming up for them. So find out what's happening. You don't have to learn things the hard way all by yourself. I think also having an outsider, while it does cost money and it sounds like I'm making a plug, but really having an outsider to help you with those conversations
Mm,
is incredibly important. You need an outside eye. And third, I think is to be okay with knowing that conflict is going to come up. Being okay with knowing that we don't know it all. We need policies. It's not that we don't trust each other, it's that we want to ensure we keep our trust. And it's a positive thing to have policies and procedures.
absolutely great, great advice. So thank you again, Wendy, for joining us
Oh,
today
thank
and
you.
giving us a little more insight to policies and procedures. I personally think they're very important, but it's sometimes hard to get the families on side. And it's also very difficult sometimes to bring in a third party because they don't want to, as they call it, air their dirty laundry, to
Yes.
a stranger. They rather keep it in house. So, but it's every family has the same issues. They're just maybe a different topic, but we all have conflict. I think every family's dysfunctional. Everybody says we have a dysfunctional family. Well, everybody says their family's dysfunctional. It functions in dysfunction. Anyway,
Yeah.
again, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's such a privilege to speak to you on this. Thank you.
If you like this episode, subscribe to the Business of Family podcast on your favorite listening platform. You can also find Blue Roots on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. On the next show, I'll be back with another amazing guest who will inspire you with their family business insights. Until then, take care and keep it in the family. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, tax, investment, or insurance advice. Before acting on any advice, please contact your personal or company advisors.